Next up, we have State Assemblymember Alex Borres, who represents the 73rd District of New York. Alex is well known in AI circles for his RAISE Act, which aims to tackle risks like the ones we've just heard about. It recently passed the New York legislature and awaits the governor's signature. He is also now running for Congress in a hotly contested primary. Just this morning, AI industry super PAC Leading the Future announced that he will be their first target. So it's excellent timing to have him here with us. This session will be on the record. Alex, over to you.
Yeah, I couldn't think of a better day to come talk to a bunch of journalists interested in AI. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. This talk is on how states should regulate AI. And so obviously I'm going to start by saying that 3 months ago, my wife and I had our first child. And the reason I say that is because, like many new parents, I'm quite reflective. And I'm thinking about the world that my child will grow up in is very different than the one that I grew up in. But when it comes to AI, the timelines of how much the world changes are not in generations. Sometimes it's just in the course of a pregnancy. And so I'm going to start by just talking about a few things that have happened, even less than that, in the last 6 months. So 5 months ago, the California Working Group on AI Frontier Policy that Gavin Newsom impaneled after he vetoed 1047 put out their final report that said policy windows do not remain open indefinitely. The stakes and costs for inaction on frontier AI at this current moment are extremely high, that we have a limited window in time in which to act. Anthropic 2 months ago said the question isn't whether we need AI governance, it's whether we'll develop it thoughtfully today or reactively tomorrow. And then just about a month ago, in the midst of tests where they were simulating users changing their behavior very quickly to see how a model would respond, Claude said, I think you're testing me. And so when things are happening this quickly, I would urge you to pay attention to what's going on in the states, because the states tend to move much, much quicker than the federal government. And there's at least 3 reasons for that. The first is that just in general, states do more of the legislating. So, for example, in 2023, Congress or New York State passed 774 laws through both chambers of the legislature and signed by the governor. Congress as a whole passed 27. Now, of course, Congresses were larger, but it limits how quickly they can iterate on any future bill. Additionally, at the state level, you get different alignments of potential interests, right? Some of the politics that at the federal level are really ground into place. At the states, there's more flexibility. You find more alliances than you would otherwise. You saw SAG-AFTRA working in California for 1047, a bill that didn't really directly impact them, but they raised it up in the public consciousness. And third, and it's obvious, but worth saying anyway, the states, you get 50 bites at the apple. You just have a lot more variation of things that are happening, where Congress, you just have one. So I'm going to talk about frontier AI bills that have been happening at the state level, 9 or 10 or so. I'm going to then go into the RAISE Act in particular and what it took to get that passed and the story, so you can see kind of how industry's been operating at that level. And I'm going to end with one quick comment on sort of federal view towards states. So first, let's go through the different bills. I realize this is probably small font. I'm happy to have this distributed later. I will also say that we've reviewed this quite a bit. There's a lot of boxes. We're making some assumptions putting it in, so don't take this as Bible, but feel pretty good about where this is representing. This is in chronological order of what has happened in the bills. So obviously 1047 is what started off this trend, Senator Scott Wiener's bill last year, which was very stringent in terms of having a safety plan, requiring third-party audits, instant reporting, whistleblower protections, basically every potential different thing you've seen in bills since. Obviously passed the legislature. It was vetoed by Gavin Newsom, who then put together that panel, which I cited at the start. So then we go into bills from this year, from 2025. And again, in order of basically when their session ends or when I think the next action might happen on the bill. So all of these are ones that, have already been dealt with. The next slide will get to some that are live. So Colorado, Rep. Manny Rutinel pushed for a bill focused just on whistleblower protections. This was the thing that industry said, okay, we can all come together and agree on whistleblower protections, but there was still opposition there. That died in committee. In Illinois, a sort of pared down version of 1047 moved. It seemed like it had a lot of progress early in session, but ultimately couldn't make it out of committee there as well. Vermont, Rep. Monique Priestley had a unique bill that instead of saying specifically what individual companies had to do, basically focused on liability and using, focused on being able to say that what a company does, like they can put whatever plan they want in place, but if something goes wrong, you will be held strictly liable for it. A different way of thinking about these kinds of bills. And then Texas, you'll note none of the boxes are checked. That is because that is the final version of the bill. The first version actually did have a lot on frontier models, but that got edited out over time. But I still include it. It's a red state. It was a Republican representative that put that bill forward and showed some interest in it, even if that wasn't the one that finally went through. Then we jump forward. Rhode Island, Victoria Gu has been a real leader in liability and using that as a means of shifting responsibility onto developers. She's also worked on the national level of requiring insurance and different models of just internalizing the risk that the companies are putting out into the world. You have the RAISE Act, which is my bill, which I'll skip for now and come back to. You have SB 53, so Scott Wiener's attempt this year, which after much negotiation back and forth actually was signed by Governor Newsom, so it became the first bill in the country to put safety standards at all on these frontier models. It mostly focused on transparency. So earlier versions include third-party audits, include some standards. The final version really just said you have to have a safety plan that you make public. It didn't put a standard on what that plan had to do or how good it had to do it. But it did require incident reporting. It did require whistleblower protections. And so I think is a really notable step forward and the first one to succeed there. Massachusetts still has a live bill that their session is ending quite soon, but is basically a copy of the original 1047. I haven't spoken to Senator Feingold in a while, but my assumption is that that will get edited to be something closer to either SB 53 or RAISE. And then Michigan, this is a Republican representative, Sarah Leitner, has introduced a scaled-down bill, quite similar to RAISE, but still has the third-party audits in it and whistleblower protections as well. Just highlighting this as this will continue to be a bipartisan issue. There's another red state that the bill is being introduced soon, but we're on the record, so I can't tell you which yet. But, you know, catch me later and maybe we can chat. That is a quick summary of what you're seeing across all of the states. I now want to get into the details of the RAISE Act in New York and then go through what it took to pass that. So RAISE took a number of twists and turns for the different versions that we could put forward. The final version requires that frontier model developers have a safety plan, that they make that safety plan public, that they actually follow that safety plan. They disclose critical safety incidents, which we define very specifically in the bill, and that they don't release models that cause an unreasonable risk of critical harm. Now, what do we mean by that? They're setting their own safety plan. And so really what it comes down to in practice is if your model is failing your own tests, if it is coming up to you to show that it is unreasonable, you can't release that model. It is targeted at avoiding a situation like the tobacco companies where they knew that their products caused cancer, but continued to deny it publicly and release their products. This is saying if you come to believe your own model is risky, that actually puts an affirmative burden on you. Now, there's a few things that were in earlier versions of the RAISE Act that didn't make it into the final version. The first, and I think the most important, is third-party audits. This was the piece that got the most extreme pushback from industry. We were told there was no way that they can do third-party audits. No one has the expertise. This market does not exist. It is impossible to push it forward. So in negotiation, it was basically made clear to me that I wasn't going to be able to pass the bill this year with third-party audits, so I had to take it out if I had a chance. Basically, a month after this bill passed, every major developer outside of Meta signed the European Code of Practice, which includes There you have it. The other part that got pulled out of the New York bill was whistleblower protections. But that was actually because we pulled out the third-party audits. So background information on New York is we have extremely broad whistleblower protections already under law. You're protected not just for reporting something that is illegal, but something that is a major risk to public safety or public health. In many ways, capturing much of what we wanted to do by including it in the RAISE Act. The innovation in the RAISE Act was that it would also apply to the third-party auditors that weren't employees at the firm. So once we took out third-party auditors, the whistleblower protections weren't actually really adding much to New York law, so we took that out to simplify the bill. The other part of New York law is that the penalty for whistleblower protections everywhere in New York law is a $10,000 fine, which is just shockingly tiny. And we were worried. I tried to increase it. I was told no chance. There have been previous legislators that have tried to increase the fines for whistleblower protections on child labor and couldn't get it above 10,000. So no way you're getting it here. And we were worried that locking in at that level of 10,000, if other states copied it, could actually be harming the ability to have whistleblower protections there. So we pulled that part out. But the real sacrifice that we made was on the third-party audits. So how did we get to this final version? What is it like to actually pass a bill at the state level? I started working on a draft of this bill in August of 2024. That was when I put the first bit together. So before 1047 was vetoed, and I went through 1047, I went through a lot of the criticism of it. I did my own review of what I thought should be included and not. And then I sent it around to all of the frontier labs. And I got a bunch of feedback on it, a bunch of red lines. I made additional changes to it. I sent them a new draft. Well, I sent one to the Assembly internal staff around November. And then I sent a new draft to all the frontier labs around December. I got a second set of red lines and feedback. We then circulated it to allies. Note that I'm saying I sent it around to the people who might oppose it before I sent it around to potential allies. That's because I wanted to hammer out what are going to be the real issues. Are there things I can take out that would cause a problem that aren't core to the bill? For me, and I think generally passing legislation, it's more important to try to get your potential enemies to neutral than it is to get your allies super excited. And so I did a lot of engaging with the frontier labs at the start, circulated to allies around January, got feedback, introduced the bill in March, got another set of red lines, made additional changes, amended it in May. That's when we first got it through committee. And at that moment, there was a real change in the opposition and in the engagement on the bill. Up until it moved in committee, basically everyone I was talking to at the Frontier Labs was their state policy people, the people who specifically are assigned to New York. And so what that means is I might have a longer term relationship with them. Some of them are new, but they sort of expect to have a longer term relationship. It also means they fundamentally accept that New York is a state and that the legislature has a right to exist. And when it passed committee, it seemed that we got bumped up a level to maybe the national people who were sort of 50-50 on if New York was a state and if they should be engaging in legislation at the state level at all, and even if they were going to at all, certainly only in California. And so some of the feedback that we got drastically changed at that point. But I had this record of, going back to August of here is all the feedback, here's all the times I've reached out, we've gotten all of this, we've engaged in this process. Then in June, we finally got a chance to actually move it. It was the last day of session for the Senate. The Assembly had 3 extra days added on, so it wasn't our last day. But it was clear it was going to move in both houses. And I got a call from one of the major labs, who will remain anonymous. And they said, could you not pass the bill? I was like, what do you mean? They're like, we just want to continue the conversation. Could you just pause it and we can talk about it more? And I said, well, we'll continue to talk about it. New York has this unique process called chapter amendments where the governor can actually negotiate changes to the bill after it's passed the legislature. That's the process we're in right now. And so I said, well, this is how we continue the conversation. We'll pass it and then we'll keep talking in chapter amendments. And they said, no, we think it'd be better if you just held the bill. We talked about it in the off session, and then you could work on it again next year. And I said, cool, are you going to pause all AI development while we do that? And that was the end of that conversation. So we passed that bill, and now it's awaiting action from the governor. About a third of the bills that New York passed end up going through the chapter amendment process, and this was always going to be one that would. Also, the medias tend to wait till the very end of the year, so not surprising that we're still here. We've had a lot of informal conversations with the governor, her team, a lot of other people involved. Once SB 53 passed, that also changed a lot of the conversations. So what used to be many pushing back and saying, veto this bill, suddenly much of the opposition came, just amended to exactly match SB 53. In some sense, I appreciate that argument. We shouldn't have different versions of compliance for their own sake. You should make sure you're being intentional with anything that's different. But I now always point out that, yes, we should make it consistent with both SB 53 and the European Code of Practice, because you have to follow both of them. And so let's make sure we're aligning with both. And you'll note that most of industry just leaves out that whole European Code of Practice as part of what they have to do. So that's most of what I wanted to share about passing at the state level, and I want to make sure there was time for Q&A, but I do want to just say something quickly about the national view on state laws, which is, this quote from David Sachs, what you've seen many versions of, which is there are 1,000 bills introduced in state legislatures to hobble AI. There's a few problems with this. The first is that's just counting bills on AI, right? So that includes... I have a bill in the New York State Legislature to expand the legal liability shield for red teaming, so that if AI companies are really hacking at their model and it happens to produce CSAM or other material that would be illegal, they are protected as long as they are affirmatively red teaming and they share that with law enforcement. That was a bill that industry asked for. That's included in this list of 1,000 bills. It is just bills on AI. Many of them are about enabling AI. You could also, the governor in New York pushed what's called Empire AI, and I have to remind people that that's because New York is the Empire State. It is not Empire Strikes Back. I was not in charge of naming. But Empire AI was a $400 million investment in buying GPUs to accelerate AI research in the state of New York. That is also included in this list of 1,000 bills. So a lot of what's happening in the state legislature might be to regulate it. Much of it might be to accelerate it. But also, regulating it doesn't immediately mean hobbling it. So that's a horse and buggy. We didn't need driver's licenses until we had cars. We didn't need traffic lights. We also didn't have investment in highways. We didn't have a lot of regulation that became necessary because technology developed. But because of that regulation, cars can go a lot faster. If we regulated cars the same way horse and buggies, you would never be going 60 miles an hour in the car. But we mandate seatbelts, and we funded highways, and we have traffic lights, and we have driver's licenses. And because of that, transportation is much faster. Having basic rules of the road, literal or metaphorical, is actually a very pro-innovation stance if done well. I fundamentally believe that the AI that wins is going to be the AI that is trustworthy. And the pushback from industry to say government has no role in establishing that trust is one that I think you're seeing people reject at every level. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much. Yes. Okay. So you talked about kind of some of New York's laws aligning with SB 53, EU Code of Practice. Obviously, we all know that Silicon Valley's argument is that we can't possibly have a patchwork of state regulations. So my question is, how are you working with other states to kind of combat that narrative and to be aligned, I guess?
A few things here. One is they say they can't deal with 50 different regulations, but they all operate in more than 50 countries. So they can. Now, whether they should, that's a reasonable point. And during this whole process, I started a group text with 9 legislators across 7 states that were working on frontier models. And we would text back and forth as negotiations were happening and try to standardize it. And if you look at the drafts over time, you'll see that Raise like borrowed some language from 1047, and then SB 53 borrowed some language from Raise. And now as we go chapter amendments, I bet you the final version of Raise borrows again from SB 53. So totally sympathetic to the need to standardize. And in fact, state legislators have been working to do exactly that. But I would also add that, there's cost to that compliance and that difficulty, but you weigh that versus the benefits too. States have a natural role as the laboratories of democracy where we're trying things because we can move faster. And then what doesn't work gets thrown away. What does work hopefully becomes a federal standard. So if Raise is the bill that's regulating AI in 5 years, that's a problem. I think we'll have failed. The point is to move things forward. And I think people who have only worked at the national level miss how often states amend their own statutes, right? Because Section 230 passed in the 90s and hasn't been amended since. States, we amend our laws every year. And so this is very much an iterative process.
Hi, thanks for being here. I'm Emily with Bloomberg. So 2 questions. One of them would be, how are you planning to respond to the Andreessen Horowitz investment in opposing your campaign? Are you worried at all about the kind of messaging that they're able to back with all that money? And then one more question after that.
Yeah, I don't find it fun to have millions of dollars spent against me. I appreciate how straightforward they're being about it. When they say, hey, we're going to spend millions against Alex because he might regulate big tech and put basic guardrails on AI, I just basically forward that to my constituents. So that part I appreciate.
Okay, and then the second question would be, how you're talking about industry lobbying of the governor right now. How successful do you think their lobbying will be? What are you hearing from the governor in terms of how receptive they are?
Governor Hochul has been a real leader in balancing innovation and safety. So I mentioned Empire AI and the big investment she's making in accelerating AI research in New York. In that same budget, she put basic guardrails around chatbots and around layoffs that come from AI. And so I found her to be very thoughtful and balanced. In this specific case, we'll see what the final version ends up. I mean, some of the lobbying has been for things that might improve the bill. So like one of the pieces that was a very late change in the bill that came from that outside push, and I think we might amend again, was it originally said that the developers had to maintain all of the tests that they did. And developers were like, hey, you really mean the safety tests, right? Not like UI tests and things. It was like, yeah, that's true. That is what we mean, actually. And so we made those changes. So not all lobbying is strengthening versus weakening. Some of it is just improving it. And so we were always expecting there to be some chapter amendments. But we'll see in terms of, where the governor comes out at the end.
I'm curious how you think about anti-AI backlash in more kind of aggressive forms, because it seems like you've, at least the way you're framing it, are trying to be responsive to industry and be very reasonable. But there have also been AI bills that are less thoughtful, and we might expect more of that as AI becomes more salient. So I'm curious how you think about positioning yourself with respect to a potential later, stronger backlash.
It's a good question. We've definitely seen a variety of bills. I don't know that I'm thinking about how I position myself. I've voted against bills in the state legislature that were regulating tech because I thought they weren't going after the goal or they had other unintended consequences. I've also co-sponsored bills that have regulated it. I sort of view each bill as it comes, and I don't know that there's a broad positioning. I do think when you're designing any bill, you want to make sure it does everything that you want it to do and nothing more. And that is a tough balance to strike, especially when it comes to these tech bills where, not everyone's going to understand every piece of it. But I wouldn't necessarily, again, put it on a spectrum of like how much backlash or how pro and anti it is. I think it's about getting the details right.
Hi there. Thanks for doing this. My name is Miranda. I'm a reporter for FedScoop. My question is, obviously you were successful in getting the RAISE Act across the finish line, and here in Washington, things aren't as successful when it comes to passing bills. Obviously, you are running to be here in Washington as well. I'm curious what your perspective is right now on the obstacles lawmakers face in actually getting AI-related legislation across the finish line. Obviously, political parties differ and majorities exist, but is there a middle ground, or has the issue of AI regulation become just too partisan at this point?
I think it's still very bipartisan. And so you're seeing on the federal level bills sponsored by a Republican and Democrat at the same time. You know, you have people like Josh Hawley has talked a lot about this on the Republican side. At the state level, you know, there's a reason I included Texas and Michigan up there and additional red states. And also with the RAISE Act in particular, the Assembly Republican leadership opposed the bill, which meant every Republican was a default no. More than half their conference flipped and voted yes for the bill. So it got majority support from Democrats and Republicans in the Assembly. In the Senate, every single Republican state senator voted yes. So RAISE Act was passed on a bipartisan basis. I actually think a lot of people are falling because they're seeing the loudest voices that are opposing it that may or may not be spending a lot of money against me. And saying, okay, you know, they're associated with one party, so this is now a partisan issue. I don't think that's true. I think if you actually talk to most voters, it's still very strongly bipartisan. And if you look at where legislation is being introduced and passed, it's still strongly bipartisan. And I don't want us to give into that narrative that this is now a partisan fight. I mean, if we get there, we get there. But right now, I'm actually pleasantly surprised at how bipartisan it's been.
Hey, Maria Curie with Axios. Tech is usually not an election issue, but I'm wondering if you think AI will be in the minds of voters in these upcoming elections, in particular, how it relates to data centers or jobs or its impact on the middle class and affordability, which of course could become a winning issue for Democrats.
I think you just answered your own question there. But yeah, I'll say this. When I first ran for office in 2022, I said, if I'm elected, I'll be the first Democrat with a degree in computer science in New York State. And about a third of the people I said that to said, who cares? And then ChatGPT comes out November of 2022. No one has said that to me since. And in fact, the much more common refrain is, I don't know what we should do about AI, but I'm so glad you're there figuring it out. So it is rising in people's consciousness, and because it's affecting so much of our daily lives, right? It is this extremely powerful, extremely generic technology that can do so many things. So yes, data centers and worry about utility prices and worry about the impact on the environment is what motivates some voters. Chatbots, what that's doing to children, and some of those horrific stories are motivating voters. The effect on the economy is motivating some voters. Fear of that worst case scenario that the RAISE Act is focused on is motivating some voters. And, you know, those all were framed negatively, but also the economic opportunity and the ability to, you know, cure diseases and new discoveries are motivating voters. Like, this is just something that's becoming more salient for everyone. And I expect that trend to continue.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Kern. I'm with the Capital Forum, and I was wanting to see, so Cruz has said he might want to keep pursuing this AI moratorium
Yes.
on the states. Obviously, you would probably not support that, but
Correct.
you know, are you concerned that that could have legs again?
Very much so.
Okay. And you know what?
I can say a few more words.
Okay.
I don't mean to just give you 2-word answers, but yes. Yeah. I'm very concerned about it. And to be clear, the best possible solution is a federal one, right? I agree with that, but it needs to actually be a solution. Like, when the question is preemption or no preemption, I think that's the wrong question. The question should be, has Congress solved the problem? If Congress solves the problem, then it can tell the states to get out of the way. But if they're not going to pass a bill that's actually addressing any of the problems, then doing a different affirmative step to say, oh, and by the way, states, you can't do anything, just like doesn't make sense to me. I had someone say like, oh, you know, it'd be terrible if airlines were regulated state by state. I agree. That's why we created the FAA. Like if you create a federal agency or you pass a federal law, then fine. If you just say, oh, states can't touch this, what are we talking about?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jonathan. I'm at the Dispatch. I'm curious what you make of some of the debates around child safety, which you just alluded to, and some of the legislation that's pending on it.
I mean, New York just as part of our budget passed regulation around chatbots requiring them to, ones that are sort of representing characters, to say at the start of the chat that they are in AI and every 3 hours of continuous session through, as well as to have policies to recognize when conversations are going towards self-harm. You know, I think we need to do more. I don't think that's going to solve the problem. The fact that Character AI has now said they won't allow people under 18, I think is a positive development, but they're not the only company out there. And so if there is one issue that is motivating people the most, it's protecting kids. Thank you so much for having me.